Welcome, everyone. My name is Hans Korteweg. I'm the Executive Director of the COGEN World Coalition. And so welcome to today's COGEN World Talks webinar. Very excited to organize this webinar in cooperation with the CHP Alliance in the US. And of course, today's webinar will focus specifically on what's happening in the US. We've heard a lot of exciting things coming out of the US over the past couple of years, especially in relation to the IRA. And we're very pleased to have with us David Gardiner, who is the Executive Director of the CHP Alliance. And he will give us an introduction to the CHP market in the USA. Just some housekeeping for everyone who's joined the line. This webinar is being recorded, so it means also that it will be made available for free on the CWC website in the coming days. So if you miss part of it or colleagues, friends have missed it, you can always direct them to the CWC website. Alas, unfortunately, our president, Thomas Smith, will not be able to join us this morning for a brief welcome and introduction. So I will take the opportunity to really welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and I'm sure some of you are joining in Asia as well. So good evening. So welcome to this COGEN World Talks webinar. Just as some background introduction, CWC was conceived a few years ago by like-minded multinational companies involved in the cogeneration value chain, as well as national associations from around the world. So CWC, if you did not know, has over 20 members, half of them being national or regional association representing CHP or cogeneration interests from around the world. And the other half are companies involved in the value chain, may they be OEMs or part of the supply chain. The organization is still in its infancy and still growing, and we're looking forward to representing the cogeneration sector at a global level, may that be vis-a-vis intergovernmental organizations such as the International Energy Agency or the other UN bodies dealing with climate change. For example, the UNFCCC is a good example of an organization that CWC is working with in terms of climate change negotiations, with the overall goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. And of course, we as an association and representing our members and their members, our overall goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but doing so in the most efficient way possible, and that's through cogeneration. And as you may know, there are many forms of technologies and applications that can be used to use fuel in the most efficient way possible, which will also results in lower or zero emissions. The US market is very interesting. It's a very interesting time also in the United States with the federal elections coming up in November. But there's been a lot of good and positive work done, especially at a federal level, to support efficient technologies and low to zero emission technologies. And so with that said, I'm very happy and pleased to welcome David Gardiner, who's actually a former president of the COGEN World Coalition, the founding president. He also is the executive director of the CHP Alliance. So David, I pass you over the floor, and you can go ahead and share your slides. David will speak, and then there'll be an opportunity towards the end of the webinar for question and answers.
Great. Thank you, Hans. It's great to be with you and with everybody else. My computer is telling me that I need to have somebody enable the screen sharing. So if you or somebody could do that, then I will put my screen up, but I wanted.
I'll ask my colleague to do that.
And can everybody see that? I'm hoping so.
Looking good.
Great. Thank you. Well, again, it's great to be with you, Hans, and with everybody else, and appreciate everybody being here. We're going to take a quick tour of the United States and where we are with CHP. I want to first, in a moment, introduce you to the Combined Heat and Power Alliance and just provide a little bit more background. Then we're going to talk about the current energy and climate context in the US and the role that CHP can play in it. We're going to talk about where we are today with the CHP market. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future markets and particularly about hydrogen, because there's been a big focus, especially by US policymakers, on the potential to very dramatically expand clean hydrogen markets. So just to let you all know, the Combined Heat and Power Alliance is the national voice for combined heat and power here in the United States. We focus on communicating the benefits of combined heat and power, advocating for a policy that would be supportive of it at both the federal and the state level, and connecting people who care about combined heat and power. You can see here the list of our members. We have 60 plus members, as well as a number of non-profit reciprocal affiliates, including the COGEN World Coalition and COGEN Europe. So very impressive set of 70 plus organizations that are working to advocate for policy and other benefits here in the United States. And if you're not already a member, we'd love to have you, of course. So let's turn to the context of the US market here. This is a projection looking out to 2050. This is really our own energy agency's projection of what, without any further policy change, the US markets would look like. Over time, you can see very large increases in solar and wind in particular, natural gas continuing to play an important role, and continuation of the trend that we've already seen in the United States to reduce the use of coal. That's, of course, the policy. This is the sort of non-policy view, but everybody's expectation is that we're headed on a path to net zero here in the United States. What you see here are big declines in the major emitting sectors: buildings, transport, industry, electricity, and of course, heat over time, with a particular focus in the short term, especially on electricity. While it says that heat is going to be decarbonized in a shorter period of time by 2035 or 2040, I think it's going to be more challenging than that. But that's certainly an important aspect of what we're thinking about here. A much more recent trend, which has been interesting, is that electricity demand is increasing quite rapidly just in the last year or so. And as one report concluded, the era of flat power demand is over. So over the past decade here in the United States, grid planners have been forecasting a really modest rate of increase, just 0.5% of annual growth. But in 2023, that peak demand growth was at almost double, 0.9%. And the forecasts for 5-year electricity demand growth have changed significantly, as you can see in the chart on the left here. In 2022, demand growth was 2.6%, still a pretty big increase over the next 5 years. Now it's 4.7%. And that's a very, very significant change. Really, electricity demand, really driven by energy efficiency, has been quite flat for quite a while. And this is a new and different thing here in the United States. And so what's driving that new demand? There are a couple of big drivers on the left-hand side. This is a compilation of new manufacturing facilities that are related to that have been announced since August 2022. These are all related to the Inflation Reduction Act, and these are related to transportation and clean energy industries in one fashion or another. There's a lot of battery facilities, for example, that have been announced here, wind and solar manufacturing facilities. So all of this new manufacturing demand is playing into it. And on the right-hand side, The other big driver are data centers, projected to grow from 17 gigawatts of demand today to 45 gigawatts by 2030. And as you can see here, these are spread across the different regions that we use for electricity planning here in the United States, but very substantial growth. In the middle of the country there, for example, 2,200 megawatts there, the Mid-Atlantic region, 2,300 megawatts of growth by 2027. So I would think it's fair to say that electricity planners are surprised by this, and this is a very, very new development in which I think CHP can potentially play an important role. So, as I mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act has been a key game changer on U.S. climate policy. It's committing more than $400 billion to combat climate change, and as you can see on the chart on the right, it was projected to yield significant emission reductions, not quite to the level of the Paris target by 2030 that we have, but making a very substantial jump in that direction. And then, of course, there's a very important component of it for combined heat and power. Through the end of this year, 2024, it created an investment tax credit, depending on how you structured it, of between 30 and 50% for combined heat and power. So that's an extremely important driver of new business development for CHP here in the United States. Beginning in 2025, the law establishes what are known as technology neutral tax credits. And it isn't clear at this point whether combined heat and power would qualify for that. The Treasury Department will make final decisions about that sometime in the coming months. We've argued certainly that combined heat and power units that burn renewable and decarbonized fuels, such as renewable natural gas, biomethane, clean hydrogen, the CHP units that do that should qualify for the tax credits. We've also argued that combined heat and power units that burn natural gas should also qualify, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. We're also advocating in addition to advocating for inclusion of CHP in the tech neutral tax credit, we're also urging Congress to extend the end of year deadline for the current tax credit, that is the 30 to 50% investment tax credit for natural gas fired CHP. We believe lots of businesses are interested in applying for the tax credit, but simply don't have enough time to be able to submit all they would need to submit before the end of the year in order to qualify for the tax credit. So we've been urging Congress to adopt that. And this chart gives you a little bit of a sense of the arguments that we're making about the role that CHP can play in this clean energy transition. And that argument is that new CHP systems, natural gas-fired CHP emissions, reduce emissions immediately in all regions of the country. And as studies have concluded, in almost all regions, CHP installed not just today, but through 2035, will reduce carbon dioxide emissions through 2050. And of course, that those units can be powered by renewable or other decarbonized fuels that deliver even lower costs and maximize carbon reductions. And the chart that you're looking at here is from New England, so Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, a relatively clean region of the country. And what you see here at the top of the chart is that the marginal grid emissions in New England are 1,071 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. And that's these are figures from EPA's own database that look back at 2021. The figures have recently been updated, but I would say that number hasn't changed a great deal. And then that black line in the middle of the chart right here is a natural gas CHP reciprocating engine 1.1 megawatts at 460 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. So you can see that there's a very substantial amount of emission reductions that can be had between that marginal emission rate at 1,071 pounds and that CHP unit at 460 pounds. And this is true in other regions of the country. Certainly there are some regions that are somewhat cleaner than New England, but not many. Most are actually have higher emissions than New England. And as the chart indicates, at least conceptually, even if we could get down to that level of a natural gas-fired CHP unit, 460 pounds of carbon dioxide, there are considerably more emission reductions to be had with renewable natural gas, biomethane, other zero carbon fuels. And so I think our argument is there are significant opportunities to be had with CHP to reduce emissions in the short term. So turning to where we stand with combined heat and power in the United States, what you're looking at here on the left is a chart that shows from the Department of Energy, and I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested in learning more about the market going to this website. They list every project that's been developed in the United States, or at least almost all of them. You can see the very broad geographic spread, especially in the highly urbanized areas in the Midwest, along the East Coast and along the West Coast. There's 80 gigawatts of installed combined heat and power at just over 4,600 industrial and commercial facilities in the U.S. To the issue we were discussing before, 72% natural gas fueled, but 15% are biomass, biogas, or municipal process waste fueled. So there's already a substantial amount of renewable fuels in the marketplace with CHP units. And that chart on the right just shows the breakdown of the kinds of facilities with the industrial sector on the far right, chemicals, petroleum refining, pulp and paper, food process, primary metals being the primary place where these facilities have been installed over time. But what we're seeing in the marketplace now is increasing numbers of CHP facilities at colleges and universities, other commercial facilities, as the systems become more competitive and smaller at smaller and smaller prices. And of course, some of that demand is also driven in part by the significant interest that hosts have in reliable power and thermal energy. Certainly here in the United States, we've had plenty of climate-induced electricity grid disruptions, and those are very, very significant drivers, we believe, especially for people like colleges, universities, hospitals, military bases. Other facilities are really a key elements of our critical infrastructure here in the United States. And then turning a little bit to the future, but also somewhat reflecting what we just looked at, these are some of the applications that we're seeing rise up. Certainly, as I mentioned, hospitals, greenhouses is an interesting new market that's emerging here in the United States where CHP is playing an important role. And interestingly enough, there are some opportunities to capture the carbon created by the CHP units that is interesting for people. Commercial and government facilities, data centers are an interesting opportunity here in the United States, in part because CHP units, obviously, when coupled with a chiller, can really help deal with the heat generated at data centers. And obviously, as we talked about earlier, there's very significant growth in data center power demand really all across the country. So we think there are good opportunities for CHP there. The traditional industrial and manufacturing plants, sewage and wastewater treatment plants, charging for electric machines of all sorts, mining, agriculture, food processing, and power companies themselves, who I think are confronted with how can we generate enough power, and particularly if we have difficulties building transmission here in the United States, how can we build this power and thermal energy as close to sites as we possibly can. The role of CHP, I think, has been importantly recognized by the Department of Energy in their strategy to decarbonize the industrial sector. As you can see here, a couple of quotes. Industrial CHP can provide significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the near to midterm as marginal grid emissions continue to be based on a mix of fossil fuels in most areas of the country. Just that same issue we were talking about with respect to New England and other regions of the country. Yes, while we have some renewable energy that's introduced into the electricity market here, it's still not large enough, even in a region like New England, that the amount of renewable energy introduced into the market is only about 10% at this point. And for the longer term, as DOE notes in its industrial decarbonization strategy, renewable natural gas and hydrogen-fueled CHP systems can be a long-term path to decarbonizing industrial thermal processes resistant to electrification because of technology or cost barriers, and for critical operations where dispatchable on-site power is needed for resilience and reliability. So I think this is a very strong endorsement from our Department of Energy. I will say, unfortunately, they recently released a strategy related to decarbonization of buildings where there was not such a strong commitment to the role of CHP. If you read the entire strategy, combined heat and power isn't mentioned even once. So we have some work to do to persuade the Department of Energy that there's opportunities in the commercial and other building sectors, because we certainly think, as you've heard me say, there are some of those opportunities. 2 years ago, we produced a clean hydrogen roadmap for CHP. We did that in part because the federal government has, as a result of not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but also our new infrastructure law, plowed a lot of money into developing clean hydrogen. And the infrastructure, in the infrastructure law, there was about $8 billion ready for hydrogen hubs. And the Department of Energy has now announced those hydrogen hubs, which are produced around the country, different regions that will be developing and focusing on production of hydrogen, preferably, as most of them are located near potential users of that clean hydrogen. Each of the hubs has a different focus on what sort of hydrogen it's developing. So it's across the rainbow of colors that we attribute to different methods of cleaning hydrogen. The Inflation Reduction Act includes a very significant production tax credit for hydrogen. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we knew a couple of years ago that this was going to be an important trend. And so we consulted with the OEMs and learned from each of them that they're developing systems that are capable of using blends anywhere between 20 and 100%. And that, if anything, has improved in the past couple of years. Certainly by 2030, and likely much sooner than that, new CHP systems can burn 100% clean hydrogen, which is, of course, the challenging thing. They're burning a renewable fuel like biomethane. That is not so complicated, as you all know, from a technical standpoint. I thought one of the most interesting parts of that study was the view from the OEMs that existing CHP systems can convert to 100% clean hydrogen at relatively low cost and during a time when they are already out for their typical overhaul, so with minimal downtime. I think that indicates that there are, for the long term, as we build up our hydrogen production here in the United States, lots of opportunities to use hydrogen in combination with CHP systems. And indeed, we should be using CHP systems to burn this clean hydrogen. It's going to make it more economical because it's efficient, but frankly, it's also going to maximize the emission reductions that those fuels can achieve by stretching the use of that fuel as far as it possibly can go. There's some analysis that production tax credit that I mentioned will also make hydrogen cost competitive with natural gas. This is from some analysis done by the Boston Consulting Group. It's a little complicated, but these red lines indicate the range of end user natural gas prices. And you can see here There's green hydrogen, which gets the most advantageous tax credit under the IRA. In effect, the IRA tax credit for hydrogen is structured in a way that you get more credit the more emission reductions you achieve. The Treasury Department is actually going through a process now to work out all the details of exactly how that will work. But you can see here that, at least according to the Boston Consulting Group, they believe that hydrogen will be in play. I think there's a big question, certainly one that we at the Combined Heat and Power Alliance have, about what's the availability of this fuel. But from a pricing standpoint, the incentives are large enough that it could be quite attractive, even in the short term, as indicated on this chart. So we tend to think about CHP with these renewable and decarbonized fuels as CHP 2.0, and think there's a significant opportunity, not just with hydrogen, but others. But we can install new hydrogen-ready CHP units even today, and certainly even more so over the next couple of years. There's an opportunity to retrofit the nearly 1,200 existing CHP units in the industrial sector to use clean hydrogen. And part of the opportunity that's interesting here is that they represent only 24% of all CHP units in the US, but produce 78% of the electrical power from all of them. So they're big units that produce a lot of electricity and presumably also a lot of thermal energy. Some of the best opportunities to be out there are in the chemicals, food processing, and pulp and paper sectors, which have more than 60% of all of the industrial CHP units between those three sectors. So we think there's some interesting opportunities in retrofitting, in addition to the new installations that we talked about earlier at places like manufacturing units, data centers, hospitals, military bases, and so on. So then, just to sum up again, I think our view is that CHP has a significant role in delivering clean and reliable power and thermal energy. That's an important thing as we both try to decarbonize and deal with rising US power demand. And I will say about that rising US power demand that those projections don't include yet the rising electrical power that will be needed as we try to electrify sectors like transportation and buildings and industry. So that power demand is going to increase over time. And we think we've got an important role to play, both in terms of meeting that demand, but also helping to decarbonize both electricity and thermal energy, which is an increasing focus here in the United States. Certainly the decisions about the tax credit for the IRA tax credit for combined heat and power that will be made this year by the Treasury Department and by Congress are critical. We're certainly very hopeful that there'll be a tax credit in place for CHP in some fashion post 2025, but that's going to be a very, very important decision. Lots of industrial and commercial market opportunities, we think, and certainly the tax credit has helped to drive a lot of interest in those. And as I've said earlier, combined heat and power is ready for clean hydrogen, but it's unclear how much and how quickly it will be available at cost-effective prices. That's clearly going to be a driver for everybody, but we're ready for that transition whenever it comes along. So Hans, there's my presentation. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that you or others may have.
Thank you, David. And just to remind everyone, you can ask your questions through the Q&A function. We don't have the facility to mute and unmute, so if you have a question, do jot it down, and I'll pass it on to David. See, we've already got one question, but before we get to that, you spoke a lot about green hydrogen, and I'm wondering what kind of potential you have in the US in terms of other green forms of fuel, specifically biomethane and biomass. Because you mentioned there that about 15% of CHP is used by the paper and pulp industry, so I would imagine there's some sort of cyclical process using biomass, and I'm wondering how much more potential you have actually in that respect.
Well, we think there's lots of opportunities both on biomethane and on biomass, but we're also recognizing, let me just say a little bit further about biomethane. There are a number of state governments that have really been working hard to incentivize or drive their natural gas utilities to be shifting in the direction of converting biomethane into what here in the United States we would call renewable natural gas, which has been processed to the level that it can go into the pipeline system. So I know, for example, I happen to live in the state of Virginia, which a year and a half ago adopted new incentives for the natural gas utility companies to capture methane at landfills, animal treatment, animal feeding operations, and other institutions to turn that into renewable natural gas and deliver it to customers. Excuse me. And we've seen other states begin to do similar kinds of things. Certainly biomass, yes. Although I think one of the things that's interesting in the United States about the pulp and paper industry, actually, Hans, is that there's a fair amount of use of natural gas even in the pulp and paper industry. Yes, there's a lot of biomass use there, and we think lots of opportunities for further biomass use. But I would say, interestingly enough, in part because natural gas is just so inexpensive here in the United States, it's a very attractive option, even in the pulp and paper industry. So I think that's part of the reason that we're believing that the role of natural gas-fired CHP continues to be important in the very, very short term. But yes, I think there's the development of other technologies. One other interesting thing that I would say is that there are some efforts underfoot to develop renewable propane, which is particularly important in rural markets here in the United States. And so renewable propane may be an opportunity with CHP units that are located in rural areas. And finally, we've got one of our members, a company called Carbon Quest, actually pairs CHP units with carbon capture and storage systems, typically in commercial buildings in cities like New York and elsewhere. So I think this is a really important and innovative development that if you'd asked me about it 2 years ago, I would have said, before I heard of this company, I would have said this is not possible. Carbon capture and storage is for really big factories and power plants, but here it is getting done on a smaller scale. They actually capture the carbon and they take that carbon and sell it to somebody who's making cement, so that person is then putting that carbon into the cement and storing it for a very, very long period of time. And I think this is the kind of innovation that we're starting to see in the CHP markets, driven in part by things like the IRA and other government policies. But I think it's just indicative that combined heat and power is ready to deliver carbon emission reductions going forward, certainly here, but I'm expecting elsewhere around the world, both with these clean fuels, hydrogen, renewable fuels like RNG or biomethane, as well as with carbon capture and storage.
Okay, thank you for that. Very, very interesting. Actually, when you were speaking about buildings and the complexity and complications of decarbonizing buildings, and it struck me, and I go back to the same slide I mentioned regarding the 15% paper and pulp industry. I was actually quite surprised that only 4% of CHP is district heating in the US. And is there a push, or are there incentives in place to increase that, or is that a geographical issue? I realize I'm coming from Europe and everything is very densely populated. Right. And in Europe, half of cogeneration is district heating, and about 70% of district heating uses CHP. So in the case of the US, is there growing interest and potential for that form of heating?
Well, I think the challenge that we've got is that compared to Europe in particular, our district heating systems are very small in number. They're typically located in older communities where those District heating systems were installed years ago, often in campus-like settings. Lots of colleges and universities, for example, have them. Some military bases have them. But there's very little district heating here. So that means that each, particularly in building settings, each individual building needs both power and thermal energy. So I think that presents kind of a different market for CHP than perhaps district heating, where you could have a bigger system that would serve, hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings potentially. But here we're going to see or have seen the installation of individual CHP units at individual buildings. And, again, I think the driver for that is reliable power, but I also believe that as the big push here in the United States, and I suspect this is true in other regions of the world, to decarbonize is to focus on electrification. But in urban areas in particular, that can be challenging, not just because of the reliability questions, but the difficulty of getting power into these very densely populated places. I talked recently to a sustainability director for a university located in an urban area up in New England here, and she was describing how difficult it would be for them to electrify everything, because it would take a decade probably to install the infrastructure they would need to electrify to bring the power into the university. And of course, that university then would be competing with other parts of the economy that might also like to electrify. So she thought it was particularly challenging. So I think these are the kinds of very practical things that particularly state and local governments have begun to encounter here in the United States as they push to try to electrify. In New York City, for example, they've adopted a policy that initially would have driven everybody towards electrification. We've been involved through our Northeast chapter and some work in New England and in New York City to try to help them understand the important role that CHP can play, and to both gas-fired and with these cleaner fuels and with the carbon capture and storage. And so I think that, as I understand it, New York City is starting to think more broadly about how they might decarbonize and look back at CHP. And obviously, we're hoping that other cities will continue to do the same.
Okay, well, you partially answered it already, but on the topic of buildings, just now, just looking to the Q&A, there was a question regarding your outlook on the future of micro CHP buildings under 100 kilowatt in the US, and do you believe the incentives will become more or less lucrative in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's a two-part question. Let me tackle the first part, which is I definitely think the micro CHP markets are a good opportunity. We've got one of our members is working on residential CHP systems. And again, I think the trend that we've seen in the United States, like with many technologies, is that while they were originally very large systems that were installed at industrial facilities, as the costs have come down, they've moved certainly into the commercial sector. I think at this stage, the residential sector is sort of what you might describe as being in a research and demonstration phase, but I certainly think there are going to be opportunities there in the really small systems, because we're seeing that. So on the second question about incentives, I would say that at the federal level, where we have really tax incentives are the primary tool, these decisions that the Treasury Department and Congress will make this year will be critical. One of the reasons that it's important to be a part of the new technology neutral tax credits is that these are long-term tax incentives. Congress adopted it really for the first time ever, tax incentives that would last for a decade. So these would last into, since we're now a few years into it, until 2032 and potentially longer. They're somewhat at the back end hinged on how much we decarbonize the electricity sector. The more we've decarbonized the electricity sector, the more rapidly those tax incentives phase out. Of course, elections can change the politics of these things, and there certainly have been pushed by some in the Congress to repeal the tax incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. I would think if there were any attempt to do that, certainly but I think many organizations would step up and push back against that. And as you saw in that chart earlier about the electricity demand growth and the construction of new manufacturing facilities in the United States, I think one of the things that's so interesting about the Inflation Reduction Act in particular is how much economic development in the manufacturing sector it's driving here in the United States. I mean, it's in a whole economic development policy all by itself, and I think once those things get started, they're hard to undo.
Yeah, there's a lot of jealousy inside the U.S. about that.
We're prepared to be copied. The one other thing I'd say, Hans, just not because here in the States, state and local governments have a very significant role, and it adds obviously a lot of complexity. But I think that one of the storms that we've been weathering is this push, especially really at local levels, but it can be at the state level too, and it's still out there. A lot of push to say, well, the only option here really is to electrify, particularly the building sector. I think there's much greater recognition than in the manufacturing sector. We can decarbonize. CHP is an important part of decarbonizing. And so state and local policies can be quite significant. I mentioned our Northeast chapter is working in New York City, but also in Massachusetts and with New York State, which are the two big markets up there, to push back on that. The Midwest Cogeneration Association recently was involved in an effort in Chicago to similarly basically require electrification of all buildings and was able to push back on that. So these state policies and local policies can be quite significant. And I still think we're seeing at the moment an awful lot of focus on electrification. And part of the things that we're working hard on is to help people understand the big role that CHP can play in decarbonizing the building sector, and why I tend to think and talk an awful lot about what's happening both with clean fuels and with that carbon capture and technology and storage technology that I talked about earlier, is to help cities and state governments understand the full capacity that CHP has to be able to decarbonize buildings, where it is going to be, I mean, for different reasons in different places, it's going to be hard to decarbonize absolutely every single building. And indeed, in many cases, it's going to be hard to decarbonize an awful lot of them simply by electrifying.
Okay, thank you for that. You were talking about the potential to retrofit existing installations. So we had a question here regarding what kind of subsidies are in place for supporting either on the CAPEX or on the OPEX side for retrofitting existing CHP facilities. I assume to use more decarbonized fuel. So either fossil natural gas or RNG, hydrogen, biomethane. And is there an endpoint to those subsidies?
Yeah, well, the short answer is there aren't very many subsidies for retrofitting. And what the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law did, I think, was to really incentivize the production of clean fuels, but not necessarily the things that are necessary kind of on the demand side. So if you're a factory, you're a building, there's an incentive, as we've discussed, for a CHP system that you could have a newly installed CHP system. There isn't something that would necessarily incentivize you to retrofit your existing system. And I think that's a weakness. And while we're somewhat distracted by and focused on the very important decisions that the Treasury Department and Congress are going to be making this year about the tax credits, I think there's a need to put together some policy that would incentivize the conversion. It'll be interesting to think about what that might look like, because our impression from talking to the equipment manufacturers is that conversion is relatively inexpensive and pretty easy to do for an existing unit. That's different than installing a new unit. But but I think also this is a barrier for some of the other technologies that could be used to decarbonize. There's no incentive, for example, for somebody to install an industrial heat pump. That doesn't exist in the Inflation Reduction Act. So to a certain extent, at the moment, combined heat and power is advantaged versus some of the other options that are out there for both buildings or factories.
Okay. I'm looking to the participants, and I was corrected. We can in fact unmute people. So I noticed that Jim Mooney raised his hand. Maybe my colleague can unmute him and allow him to ask his question. Jim, you just have to unmute yourself. Or perhaps it was just a slip of the keyboard. All right, I guess not.
But Hans, can I go back? I realized I'm not sure I fully answered that previous question.
About retrofitting.
About retrofitting, because the incentives on the fuel side are production incentives. So there's a production tax credit for hydrogen, for example. So that's all designed to obviously to bring down the price of hydrogen. There isn't something that I'm aware of on the fuel side there that would incentivize particularly the installation. There's a separate pot of money that I described that's available for these hydrogen hubs. It's not totally clear exactly how that's going to be spent, but I think in each of these regions, they're getting about $1 billion to incentivize, again, the production and potentially the distribution of hydrogen in the area. So again, this is really focused on the production side and not on the demand side, and for the fuels. And the other part of that question was, how long do these subsidies last? Again, for the hydrogen production tax credit, that's a 10-year, it's in essence a 10-year window taking us to 2032.
Okay. Maybe one question from you, one final question for you, and it's regarding targets. Are there targets in place for the production of green hydrogen or biomethane in the US at a federal level to encourage, in tandem with what you've already described in terms of tax credits and other incentives, other than just greenhouse gas reductions?
The targets that have been set, there are targets for hydrogen. They're really focused on cost reduction. The Department of Energy's target for hydrogen is to reduce its cost by fivefold. So it's a cost reduction target, and I think that makes sense. Again, you have to keep in mind that through our Department of Energy, really a very large part of what they do is research, develop, and demonstrate projects. So they are thinking about this very much in the context of it's a cost reduction approach. There may be, I'm just not familiar with whether there's an overall goal for production. I don't think so, but I'll admit my knowledge is not complete. And I know of nothing on the biomethane side that is out there. Again, particularly because natural gas is regulated at the state level. I think there's more of a focus on that by state governments and trying to think about is there a role there for renewable natural gas? And as I mentioned, the legislation in Virginia that it had no target associated with it, just a different set of utility incentives to get utilities there. And I think that's much more likely to be a state-based issue rather than a federal issue. I'm certainly not aware of any federal effort or target for biomethane or renewable natural gas.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I mean, the reason why I asked you is it's clear there are different approaches in different parts of the world. In Europe, for example, there are targets in place to produce, say, 20 BCM of green hydrogen by 2030, or 35 BCM of biomethane by 2030. But because Europe, for example, is not one homogeneous entity, and tax codes and tax regulations are different in every member state, that it's almost impossible to replicate the IRA at an EU level. Of course, definitely at a member state level. So, but a lot of interesting things, and hopefully some very interesting best practices that can be replicated around the world when it comes to the US, and obviously a very interesting and growing market, and still a lot of potential for CHP to grow in the US. So we'll continue to follow your progress in the US and the great work by the CHP Alliance. As we're running out of time, I'll just wrap things up from our side. So I'd like to thank David again for taking the time to share what's going on in the US. As I mentioned, it's an very interesting market, a lot of interesting developments, support at many different levels, not just the federal level, which was the focus of today's webinar, but there's a lot of work also being done at a local and at a state level in the US. So if you're interested or more interested to get involved in the US, please do reach out to David and the CHP Alliance, and it's an excellent organization to join and participate and be part of that growing community. So thank you again, David. And for everyone's information, we are organizing a few more webinars before the summer break. So we're expecting to organize a webinar focusing specifically on Germany in May. So look out for the save the date and the registration. Germany is also a very interesting market. It's an enormous CHP market, and due to different government policies, the phasing out of nuclear power, the increased use of coal, the need to reduce coal consumption, there is a lot of movement in the energy sector in terms of the potential, and CHP has the potential to support that transition as well, and also to the future. And then in June, we expect also to organize a webinar focusing specifically on Brazil. Brazil is also a very interesting market, one of the largest CHP markets in South America, very much focused on the sugarcane industry. A lot of biomass is obviously used there, but a lot of developments there as well. And so we're looking forward to involving COGEN Brazil to share their insights and what's happening in the market there. So look out for that. So both Germany and Brazil, and hopefully we'll have some more interesting webinars in the near future to continue sharing best practices, different solutions and technologies, different fuels, different applications. So thank you for everyone's participation, and thank you again, David, and your team and the CHP Alliance for going to participate in today's webinar and sharing your insight into the US. So with that said,
thank you, Hans.
Thank you to all our participants. Thank you to the team behind organizing the webinar in the background, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone in the next webinar at some point in May. So look out for that email. Thank you, everyone, and have a good morning or good afternoon or good night.